What would you do if you found out that the coffin in which your loved one was buried had already been used dozens of times, and that the bodies of other people you knew nothing about could be lying inside it? In the quiet town of Tula, in the early 20th century, amidst the creaking of carts and the ringing of church bells, one of the most grim stories of the Russian Empire was born. The story of a man who turned death into a profitable business, using methods that would make the blood run cold even in the most resilient. This story remained buried in the archives for a long time, but now we will reveal all the details of this horrifying affair. If you're interested in stories that reveal the dark sides of human nature, subscribe to our channel, where we explore forgotten pages of history. On a cold February morning in 1912, when a gray sky hung over Tula and the snow crunched under the feet of passers-by, a young assistant priest, Dmitry Sokolov, was preparing for another burial in the city cemetery. Dmitry, a 23-year-old graduate of the theological seminary, had arrived in Tula from Moscow only 3 months earlier and was still getting used to local customs. That morning, he was particularly focused. He was about to bury the wife of a city official, which required special attention to detail. The sky was covered with heavy clouds, and the air was filled with a damp chill that penetrated to the bones. Dmitry arrived at the cemetery early to check all the preparations. The grave had been dug, the wooden cross was ready, but something in the atmosphere of the cemetery disturbed the young man. The silence seemed unnatural. Even the crows, usually circling over the cemetery trees, had disappeared somewhere. Sokolov headed for a small wooden guardhouse, where the gravedigger Alexander Ivanov, a man in his 50s with a gray beard and deep-set eyes, was usually located. Ivanov had worked in the cemetery for more than 15 years and knew more about death than anyone else in the city, or at least that's what they said. The door to the guardhouse was ajar, and Dmitry knocked cautiously. "Alexander Petrovich, are you here?" There was no answer. Sokolov pushed the door open and stepped inside. The guardhouse smelled of dampness, tobacco, and something else, a Swedish odor that Dmitry didn't immediately recognize. A small window let in meager light, in which dust motes floated. On the table was a kerosene lamp, an unfinished glass of tea, and some papers. Dmitry had no intention of rummaging through other people's things, but his gaze accidentally fell on an open notebook, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. In the notebook, in neat handwriting, were written names and dates, many names. Next to each one were numbers and some notes. At first, Sokolov thought it was a register of burials, but then he noticed a strange detail. Some names were repeated several times with different dates. Next to some were the words "full set," next to others, "coffin only." Dmitry turned the page and saw a list of addresses of Tula residents and the sums opposite each one. Some of the figures were quite significant. At the very bottom of the page was a note written in red ink: Nikitin, payment delayed, replaced with Fedorov. The sound of footsteps behind him made Dmitry flinch. He turned sharply and saw Ivanov in the doorway. The gravedigger looked at him with an impenetrable gaze. His right hand was hidden behind his back. "Looking for something, Mr. Sokolov?" Ivanov's voice was calm, but there was a threat in it. Dmitry swallowed nervously. "I just wanted to make sure everything is ready for today's funeral. The procession will arrive in an hour." Ivanov nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the notebook on the table. "Everything is ready, don't worry. The grave has been dug. The coffin will be delivered on time." "The coffin? Won't the family bring it with them this time?" "No, they ordered everything from me there." Ivanov stepped into the guardhouse, and Dmitry noticed that he was only holding a coil of rope in his hand. "It would be better if you went to the church and waited there. I'll finish the last preparations." Sokolov nodded and headed for the exit, but a sudden thought made him stop. "Alexander Petrovich, what does the note 'coffin' only mean in your notebook?" The gravedigger's face changed for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "These are my personal work notes, Mr. Sokolov. Nothing that should concern you." Dmitry left the guardhouse with a heavy feeling. Something in Ivanov's words and behavior aroused deep anxiety. On the way to the church, he couldn't stop thinking about the strange entries in the notebook. The funeral went as usual. The priest read prayers, the relatives cried, the coffin was lowered into the grave. But Dmitri couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He watched Ivanov carefully during the ceremony. The gravedigger stood aside. His face remained impassive, but in his eyes, Sokolov noticed something like mockery. After everyone had left, Dmitri decided to stay behind. He told the priest that he wanted to pray in solitude and returned to the cemetery. From afar, he saw Ivanov doing something at the fresh grave. Sokolov hid behind a large tombstone and began to watch. What he saw next was mind-boggling. Ivanov was digging up the recently filled grave. He worked quickly and methodically like a man who had done this many times. After 20 minutes, he reached the coffin, opened the lid, and took out the body, wrapping it in burlap. The gravedigger heaved the corpse onto his shoulder and headed for a small shed in the far corner of the cemetery. He carefully pulled the coffin out of the hole and carried it to the shed as well. Dmitri's heart was pounding so hard that it seemed its knocking echoed throughout the cemetery. He couldn't believe his eyes. Sacrilege, desecration of graves, it was unthinkable. But even more horrifying, why did Ivanov need the body? Waiting for the gravedigger to disappear into the shed, Sokolov left the cemetery on shaky legs. He needed to collect his thoughts and decide what to do next. Dmitri didn't sleep that night. He went over in his mind all possible explanations for what he had seen, but none seemed plausible. In the morning, he decided to conduct his own investigation. First, he went to the city archive, where records of all the funerals in Tula for recent years were kept. The archivist, an elderly man with thick eyebrows and worn pince-nez glasses, initially refused to grant access to the documents without official permission. But when Dmitri mentioned that he was acting on behalf of the church and investigating possible violations of burial rites, the old man softened. "Here are the journals for the last 5 years," said the archivist, placing thick books with tattered bindings on the table. "All burials are recorded by date, with names and causes of death indicated." Dmitri immersed himself in studying the records. He was looking for any inconsistencies, oddities, repeating names, anything that could shed light on Ivanov's activities. After several hours of painstaking work, he began to notice patterns. The journals recorded several dozen funerals where Alexander Ivanov was listed as the organizer. This in itself was not unusual. Gravediggers often took on the organization of funerals for poor families or single people. But Dmitri noticed something else. The death records of some of these people contained strange notes: body not found, burial without examination based on eyewitness testimony. Even more alarming was that Sokolov found records of the funerals of people who, according to other documents, were buried 2 or even 3 times, with intervals of several months or years. In each such case, Ivanov was the organizer. One record particularly caught Dmitri's attention. A certain Fyodor Nikitin, 42 years old, who died of consumption, was buried in March of 1910. Then, the same Fyodor Nikitin appeared in the records of a funeral in August of 1911, and the cause of death this time was listed as drowning. "This is impossible," Dmitri whispered. "A man cannot die twice." He remembered the entry in Ivanov's notebook: Nikitin, payment delayed, replaced with Fedorov. The first name was different, but the surname coincidence made Sokolov think. What if this is a system? What if Ivanov somehow uses the same bodies for different funerals? But why? What benefit could be derived from such sacrilege? Dmitri decided to dig deeper. He turned to the records of births and deaths, comparing them with the funeral journals, and discovered another oddity. Some people whose funerals were organized by Ivanov, according to official documents, had never existed at all. Their names were missing from the birth records. They didn't appear in any other documents. Ghosts, thought Sokolov. He's burying ghosts. But if there are no bodies, then what is in the coffins that are lowered into the ground? And why are families paying for the funerals of non-existent relatives? Leaving the archive, Dmitri felt even more confused than when he had entered. He realized that he had only touched the surface of something sinister and deeply wrong, but to move forward, he needed more concrete evidence. Sokolov decided to turn to a man who could shed light on Ivanov's activities. The old cemetery watchman, Efim Kuzmich, who had worked there before Ivanov and, according to rumors, still lived nearby. Efim Kuzmich's house was on the outskirts of the city, not far from the cemetery. It was a small, rickety hut surrounded by a high fence. When Dmitri knocked on the gate, he didn't get an answer for a long time. Finally, the wicket creaked open, and the wrinkled face of an old man appeared. "What do you want, young man?" Efim's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Dmitri introduced himself and explained that he was investigating possible violations in the cemetery. At the mention of Ivanov's name, the old man's eyes narrowed, and he quickly looked around. "Come into the house," he muttered. "It's not worth talking about such things on the street." Inside, the hut was dark and smelled of herbs. Efim lit a candle and pointed Dmitri to a bench at the table. "I knew this would come up someday," said the old man, heavily sinking into the chair opposite. "Ivanov, he's not just a gravedigger. He does things that are better not known to the living." "What do you mean?" asked Dmitri, feeling a chill run down his spine. Efim was silent for a long time, as if gathering his thoughts. Then he began to speak in a quiet, broken voice. "It started about 10 years ago. Ivanov came to the cemetery as a simple worker, helping to dig graves, taking care of the territory, but I immediately noticed something strange in him. He was too interested in the dead, spent more time with them than necessary. Sometimes I caught him talking to the bodies before burial." The old man took a sip of water from a clay mug and continued. "Then strange things began to happen. Fresh graves would be dug up, but nothing would be missing, neither valuables nor bodies. At least that's what it seemed at first glance. I started watching Ivanov, and one night I saw him digging up a coffin, opening it but not touching the body. He just measured it, wrote something down, and then buried it again." Dmitri listened, holding his breath. The story was getting creepier and creepier. Then Ivanov began to offer his services in organizing funerals, first to poor families who couldn't afford a decent burial. He took very little money, said he was doing a godly deed, but I knew something was wrong, especially when I noticed that the same coffin was being used for different funerals. "The same coffin?" Sokolov asked. "Yes, you see, coffins are expensive, especially good ones, and Ivanov's were always solid, with carvings, upholstered in velvet, too good for the money he was taking. I began to notice the same scratches on them, the same patterns. They were the same coffins, which he somehow returned after the funerals. But how is that possible? Coffins are buried in the ground." Dmitri wondered. "He dug them up at night, wrapped the bodies in burlap and took them somewhere, and cleaned the coffins and used them again. But that's just the beginning." Efim leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Then I found out that Ivanov was organizing fake funerals. You see, people pay him money to bury relatives who never existed. But why would anyone need that? Different reasons. Someone wants to get an inheritance by faking the death of a wealthy relative. Someone hides a crime. Someone just wants to be considered a noble person who paid for a decent funeral for a poor relative. In any case, Ivanov provides the entire ceremony. The coffin, the bodies, the witnesses, the documents. The body!" Dmitri felt everything inside him turn cold. "You mean, in the coffins, at these fake funerals, there really are bodies?" Efim nodded grimly. "Of course, otherwise who would believe it? Relatives must see the body to say goodbye to it. Ivanov uses the real corpses of those who have already been buried before. He digs them up, puts them in order, and rents them out for the next funeral." Dmitri felt nauseous. The story the old man was telling was so monstrous that it was hard to believe, but it explained all the oddities he had noticed in the archival records. "And what happens to the bodies after these fake funerals?" "Ivanov digs them up again and either returns them to their original graves or uses them for the next clients. He has a special place where he stores them, the shed on the far edge of the cemetery. He has a whole collection there. And no one noticed? No one reported to the authorities?" Efim smiled bitterly. "Who will check the graves after the funeral? Who will dig up the ground to make sure the body is in place? And if someone did notice something strange, Ivanov knows how to persuade or pay. He has his own people everywhere, in the police, in the city administration, even in the church. I tried to tell the truth, but they declared me a crazy old man and kicked me out of the cemetery. Dmitri was silent, trying to grasp the scale of what was happening. If Efim's words were true, then Ivanov had been desecrating graves for years, using the bodies of the dead for his machinations, deceiving families and the church. "Do you have any evidence?" he finally asked. "Something that could convince the authorities?" The old man shook his head. "It's just my word against his. And who will believe an old watchman when on the other side is a man who has organized hundreds of funerals, whom the whole city knows and respects?" But then Efim's face lit up. "Although there is something. Ivanov keeps a record of his affairs in a special book, a large black notebook in a leather binding. Everything is recorded there. Names, dates, sums, special notes. If that book fell into the hands of the authorities, Ivanov would be hanged." "I saw the notebook in his guardhouse," said Dmitri. "But I didn't read it all. We need to go back and take it." "Be careful," Efim warned. "Ivanov is dangerous. He will stop at nothing to keep his secret. And remember, he has patrons in the city." Leaving the old watchman, Dmitri felt as if he had woken up from a nightmare, only to find that the nightmare was real. He didn't know whether to believe everything Efim had said, but much of it coincided with what he himself had seen and found in the archives. Sokolov decided to act immediately. He headed for the cemetery, planning to break into Ivanov's guardhouse and find the black notebook. It was the middle of the day, and he hoped that the gravedigger would be busy with his usual affairs away from the house. Approaching the cemetery, Dmitri noticed unusual activity. Several carriages stood at the gate. A crowd of people in black had gathered inside. Another funeral. Sokolov mentally cursed his bad luck. Now Ivanov would certainly be in the cemetery, and getting to the guardhouse unnoticed would be more difficult. But then another thought came to Dmitri. What if this funeral was one of the fake ceremonies that Efim had talked about? It would be a chance to see everything with his own eyes, to obtain irrefutable evidence. He quickly pulled a church hat over his head, adjusted his collar, and, putting on a mournful look, mingled with the crowd of mourners. No one paid attention to him. In such moments, people are too absorbed in their grief to notice unfamiliar faces. The procession moved towards the far part of the cemetery, where the newer burials were located. Dmitri kept to the back rows, carefully observing what was happening. He noticed Ivanov leading 4 men who were carrying the coffin. The gravedigger's face was solemn, but in his eyes, as it seemed to Sokolov, the same hidden mockery flickered. The coffin was truly magnificent. Dark wood, intricate carvings, silver handles, too luxurious for an ordinary funeral. Dmitri remembered Efim's words that Ivanov uses the same expensive coffins repeatedly. When the procession stopped at a freshly dug grave, Sokolov pushed his way closer, trying not to attract attention. He wanted to see the face of the deceased, to make sure that it was really the person being buried, and not someone else's body. The priest, it was not the rector of the church where Dmitri served, but someone unfamiliar, began the funeral service. Ivanov gave a sign, and the coffin lid was opened for the last farewell. In the coffin lay an elderly man with a gray beard, dressed in a dark suit. His face was calm, his hands folded on his chest. Everything looked perfectly normal, but something in the appearance of the deceased alerted Dmitri. He looked closer and understood what it was. The man's face was too well-groomed for a corpse. Traces of rouge were visible on his cheeks. His lips were tinted to look more natural, and his skin seemed unnaturally smooth and waxy. Next to Dmitri stood an elderly woman in deep mourning, quietly crying into a handkerchief. Sokolov leaned towards her and asked cautiously, "Please accept my condolences. Who was the deceased to you?" The woman looked at him with reddened eyes. "This is my brother, Stepan Ilyich. He was ill for a long time, heart problems. The doctor said he didn't have much time left." Dmitri nodded with a sympathetic look. "And where did he live? I think I saw him in the city." "No, probably not." The woman shook her head. "Stepan lived in a village near Kaluga for the last 5 years. He came to Tula only a month ago, when he became very ill. He wanted to be buried next to his parents. This information made Dmitri even more wary. If the man had come to the city only a month ago and immediately fell ill, he was unlikely to be known by anyone in Tula, an ideal candidate for substitution. No one would notice if there was another person in the coffin, of similar build and age. After the end of the ceremony, when the coffin had already been lowered into the grave and the relatives began to disperse, Dmitri noticed that Ivanov was talking quietly about something with a man in an expensive coat. The man handed the gravedigger an envelope, which he quickly hid in his inner pocket. They exchanged a few more phrases, after which the man got into a carriage and drove away. Sokolov decided to wait until the cemetery was empty in order to verify his suspicions. He hid behind a large crypt, from which there was a good view of the fresh grave. About 2 hours passed. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the cemetery crosses and monuments in golden red tones. Finally, the last visitors left the cemetery. Ivanov did not keep him waiting long. As soon as it got dark, he appeared at the grave with a shovel and a lantern. Dmitri held his breath, watching as the gravedigger methodically dug up the earth. He worked quickly and confidently and soon reached the coffin. Opening the lid, Ivanov first took out some items from the coffin. It seemed to Dmitri that these were jewels, with which the deceased had been decorated, and put them in his pocket. Then what happened finally confirmed all of Sokolov's worst suspicions. Ivanov extracted the body from the coffin, but treated it without any respect, as if it were some kind of object. He quietly pulled off the formal suit, leaving him in a simple canvas shirt, then wrapped the body in burlap and heaved it onto his shoulder. He carefully pulled the coffin out of the hole and placed it on the ground. After that, Ivanov headed for the very shed that Efim had talked about. Dmitri, trying not to make noise, followed him, keeping in the shadows. The shed was in the very far corner of the cemetery, hidden behind tall trees. It was an unremarkable wooden structure with a small window, in which a dim light was now burning. Sokolov crept up to the window and looked inside. What he saw made his heart stop with horror. Inside the shed were several tables on which bodies lay in varying degrees of decomposition. Along one of the walls were coffins of different sizes and finishes, from simple wooden ones to luxurious velvet upholstered ones. On shelves along another wall were jars with some kind of liquids, tools, brushes, and jars of paints. Ivanov placed the body he had brought on one of the tables and began to prepare it. He washed the face of the deceased with some kind of solution, then began to apply a composition from the jar to the skin. Obviously, this was a means of preserving the bodies, something like embalming fluid. After that, the gravedigger took a brush and a jar of paint and began to tint the face of the dead man, giving him a more lifelike appearance. Dmitri was so shocked by what he saw that he did not immediately notice that a branch under his foot had crunched, betraying his presence. Ivanov sharply raised his head and looked towards the window. For a moment their eyes met, and Sokolov saw in them not surprise or fear, but a cold, calculated rage. Without hesitation, Dmitri ran. He heard the door of the shed slam shut, as heavy footsteps rang out behind him. Ivanov was chasing him. Sokolov ran between the graves, stumbling over protruding stones and roots. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the sound of his own blood was ringing in his ears. He had almost reached the cemetery gates when something heavy crashed down on his head. The world around him exploded with pain. Black spots floated before his eyes. The last thing Dmitri remembered before losing consciousness was Ivanov's face, distorted by anger, looming over him. When Sokolov came to, it was pitch dark around him. His head was splitting with pain, and he tasted a metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He tried to move and realized with horror that he couldn't. His arms and legs were tightly bound. Dmitri was lying on something hard and narrow, wood. He ran his fingers over the surface beneath him and felt soft upholstery. Coffin. He was in a coffin. Panic seized Sokolov. He began to scream and thrash in his confinement, but only injured his hands on the nails sticking out of the lid. The coffin was closed, but apparently not yet nailed shut completely. "Help! Somebody help!" Dmitri shouted, but his voice echoed dully off the walls of the coffin, not penetrating outwards. Suddenly, he heard the sound of a door opening and footsteps. The coffin lid creaked open, and Dmitri saw Ivanov's face leaning over him, illuminated by the dim light of a lantern. "Woke up, little dove?" The gravedigger smirked. "You're screaming in vain. No one will hear you here." What are you doing?" Sokolov croaked. "Why all this?" Ivanov placed the lantern on the edge of the coffin and sat down next to it. "You know too much, Mr. Assistant Priest, you've seen too much, and I can't allow someone to destroy the business I've been building for years. People will look for me." Dmitri tried to speak confidently, but his voice trembled treacherously. "They will," Ivanov agreed, "but not for long. I'll say that you left on family matters, and then a letter will come from your village saying that you died of a fever. You'll even be buried with honors. True, it won't exactly be you in the coffin or not you at all." The gravedigger laughed, clearly pleased with his joke. You're crazy?" Dmitri whispered. "No, I'm a businessman," Ivanov replied calmly. "I just found a way to make money on something that no one needs. Think about it, who needs the dead? They are buried in the ground and forgotten, and I give them a second life. They serve the living, help solve their problems, and everyone is happy." "This is sacrilege," Sokolov exclaimed. "You desecrate the memory of the dead. You deceive their families." "Sacrilege?" Ivanov leaned closer, his eyes gleaming in the light of the lantern. "And what does the church do if it doesn't make money on death? Funeral services, prayers, memorial services, everything has its price. I just found a way to get a little more out of what still disappears into the ground anyway." Dmitri turned away, unable to bear the gaze of this man. "What are you going to do with me?" "I haven't decided yet," Ivanov shrugged. "Maybe I'll use you for the next funeral. I just have a client who needs to bury a young relative in order to get an inheritance. You fit the age and appearance. Or maybe I'll just bury you here in one of the old graves. No one will check." He picked up the lantern and stood up. "Rest for now. I'll be back in the morning, and we'll decide your fate." The coffin lid slammed shut, and Dmitri was left in complete darkness again. Despair seized him. He understood that there was practically no chance of salvation. Ivanov had certainly locked the door to the shed, and it was unlikely that anyone would hear the screams from the coffin. But Sokolov was not going to give up. He began to methodically work on the ropes that were tying his hands, rubbing his wrists against a protruding nail in the wall of the coffin, ignoring the pain and blood seeping from his wounds. Time passed, and finally he felt the ropes begin to loosen. After several hours of persistent work, Dmitri managed to free his hands. Then, he untied his legs and tried to open the coffin lid. It was difficult to budge. Obviously, Ivanov had placed something heavy on it, but eventually Sokolov managed to lift it enough to crawl out. He found himself in the very shed he had seen earlier. In the dim light filtering through a small window, he could make out the outlines of tables with bodies and rows of coffins against the wall. The smell of formaldehyde and decay assaulted his nostrils, causing nausea, but Dmitri held it back. Now was not the time for weakness. He looked around for a way out. The door was locked from the outside, but the window seemed large enough to squeeze through. Sokolov dragged one of the empty coffins to the wall, climbed onto it, and peered outside. It was the dead of night. The cemetery was plunged into silence. Only an owl hooted somewhere in the distance. The distance from the window to the ground was about 2 meters. A jump would be painful but not fatal. Dmitri was about to climb out when his gaze fell on a shelf next to the window. There lay the very black notebook that Yefim had mentioned. Sokolov hesitated for only a moment. This notebook could become evidence against Ivanov, a way to put an end to his monstrous activities. He grabbed the book, tucked it inside his coat, and climbed out the window. The landing was rough. Dmitri twisted his ankle and lay on the ground for a few seconds, writhing in pain. But fear of Ivanov was stronger. Gathering all his strength, Sokolov got up and limped toward the exit of the cemetery. The gates were locked, but the low stone fence around the cemetery did not present a serious obstacle. Dmitri climbed over it and found himself on a deserted street. It was long past midnight. The city was asleep. Sokolov headed toward the priest's house, where he had been staying. There, he would be safe. There, he could tell everything he had learned. But halfway there, Dmitri stopped. What if Ivanov had beaten him to it? What if he had already visited the priest and told some lies about him? Or worse, what if he had harmed the priest? No, returning home was too risky. Instead, Sokolov decided to go to the police station. Even if Ivanov had connections in the police, he probably hadn't had time to warn everyone. And the notebook in Dmitri's hands should be irrefutable proof of the Gravedigger's crimes. There was a light on in the police station. The duty officer, an elderly sergeant with a magnificent mustache, looked with surprise at Sokolov, who entered bloodied in torn clothes, with a crazed look in his eyes. "Good heavens, what happened to you?" exclaimed the sergeant, jumping up from his seat. "I need to speak to the chief of police immediately," Dmitri blurted out. "I've discovered a terrible crime. The gravedigger, Alexander Ivanov, is desecrating graves, using the bodies of the dead for fake funerals, deceiving families and the church. I have proof." The sergeant looked at him with obvious disbelief. "Calm down, young man. The chief of police is asleep at this hour. You can come in the morning and—" Dmitri slammed his fist on the table. "You don't understand. Ivanov tried to kill me. He could escape by morning, destroy the evidence. We need to act immediately." The sergeant frowned, but seeing the despair in Sokolov's eyes, he softened. "All right, I'll wake the captain. But if this turns out to be a false alarm—" "It's not a false alarm." Dmitri took the black notebook from inside his coat and placed it on the table. "Everything is written here. Names, dates, amounts, proof that Ivanov has been engaged in his monstrous business for years." The sergeant picked up the notebook and began to leaf through it. As he read, his face changed from skeptical to shocked, and finally to genuinely alarmed. "Good God!" he muttered. "If this is true, wait here." He disappeared into the depths of the station, taking the notebook with him. Dmitri sank onto a bench by the wall, feeling the tension of the past hours receding, replaced by exhaustion. But it was too early to relax. He wouldn't be safe until Ivanov was behind bars. 15 minutes later, the chief of police, Captain Nikolai Vasilyevich Trafimov, a tall man with a military bearing and a penetrating gaze, entered the room. He was holding the black notebook in his hands. "You're Dmitri Sokolov?" he asked, staring intently at the priest's assistant. "Yes, Captain. Tell me everything from the beginning, and don't leave out a single detail." Dmitri took a deep breath and began his story. He spoke of how he first noticed the strangeness in Ivanov's behavior, about the visit to the archives, about the conversation with the former watchman Yefim, about what he had seen in the shed at the cemetery, and finally about his kidnapping and miraculous escape. The captain listened carefully, occasionally making notes in a notebook. When Sokolov finished, Trafimov was silent for a moment, then said, "If even half of what you've told me is true, then we're dealing with one of the most heinous crimes I've ever heard of. But this notebook," he held up the black book, "seems to confirm all your words. There are indeed detailed records of every operation here. Names, amounts, special requests from clients, and even a list of people Ivanov paid to keep silent. Are there any police officers on that list?" Dmitri dared to ask. Trafimov nodded grimly. "Yes, and that makes the situation even more complicated. But I will not allow such crimes to go unpunished, no matter who is involved." He turned to the sergeant. "Gather the men as quickly as possible. We're going to the cemetery immediately to arrest Ivanov." Half an hour later, a squad of police officers, led by Captain Trafimov and Dmitri, drove up to the cemetery. It was about 3 in the morning. The cemetery gates were still locked, but one of the policemen quickly dealt with the lock. "Where is this shed you were talking about?" the captain asked Sokolov. "In the far corner of the cemetery, behind the old crypts," Dmitri replied. The squad moved in the indicated direction, lighting the way with flashlights. The cemetery looked ominous in their flickering light. Crosses and monuments cast long shadows. The wind rustled in the branches of the trees, creating the impression that the dead themselves were whispering to each other. As they approached the shed, Trafimov gestured for everyone to stop. Light was coming from under the door of the shed. Someone was inside. "Surround the building," the captain commanded quietly. "Two to the back wall, the rest with me to the door. Be careful, he may be armed." The police officers took their positions. Trafimov, drawing his revolver, approached the door and knocked loudly. "Police, open up immediately." Inside the shed, something fell. Hasty footsteps were heard. The captain, without waiting for an answer, nodded to two officers, and they forced the door open. The scene that confronted the police officers made even the seasoned Trafimov pale. In the center of the shed stood Ivanov. His hands were covered in blood. On the tables lay bodies in various stages of decomposition, some partially dissected. Against the walls stood coffins, on the shelves jars of chemicals, tools, wigs, clothing. It was a true workshop of death. "Alexander Ivanov, you are under arrest for desecration of graves, fraud, and attempted murder," announced Trafimov, pointing his revolver at the gravedigger. Ivanov did not look surprised or frightened. A strange smile appeared on his face. "You found me so quickly, Captain. I'm impressed, but you're too late." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, Ivanov raised his hand, and everyone saw a deep gash on his wrist, from which blood was flowing profusely. "I'm not going to rot in prison or hang from a noose," the gravedigger said calmly. "I'd rather join those I've worked with all these years." He staggered and fell to his knees. Trafimov rushed to him, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. The poison that Ivanov had taken before their arrival was already doing its work. A few minutes later, the gravedigger was dead. The investigation that followed the arrest shocked all of Tula. It turned out that during the 10 years of his activity, Ivanov had organized more than 100 fake funerals, using bodies dug up from other graves for this purpose. His clients were representatives of all walks of life, from poor peasants wishing to receive insurance for a supposedly deceased relative to wealthy merchants and nobles hiding their dark dealings. The black notebook that Dmitry found contained a complete list of Ivanov's clients and accomplices, including several police officers, city officials, a judge, and even a priest. All of them were brought to justice and received various prison sentences. The bodies found in the shed were reburied with honors, and the shed itself was burned to the ground to erase any reminder of the monstrous crimes that had been committed there. Dmitry Sokolov became a true hero of the city. His courage and perseverance helped to uncover one of the most terrible crimes in the history of Tula. The church rewarded him, and soon he received his own parish in one of the city's churches. But the story of Alexander Ivanov did not end there. A few months after his death, strange things began to happen in the cemetery. Watchmen claimed that at night they heard sounds coming from the gravedigger's grave, as if someone was scratching from the inside, trying to get out. Some swore they had seen Ivanov's ghost wandering among the tombstones with a lantern in his hand. Then bodies began to disappear. Relatives who came to the cemetery discovered the dug-up graves of their loved ones. But unlike in Ivanov's time, these graves remained empty. There were neither coffins nor bodies in them. Several times, the police organized ambushes in the cemetery, but no one could be caught. The grave robbers acted elusively, leaving no traces. Especially frightening was the fact that one morning, the watchman discovered a freshly dug grave, not a disturbed existing grave, but a new, neatly dug pit, next to which lay a note written in handwriting frighteningly similar to Ivanov's. "We'll see you there soon." These events so alarmed the townspeople that many refused to bury their relatives in that cemetery. Some even exhumed previously buried loved ones and reburied them in other places. Dmitry Sokolov, now a priest, was one of the few who did not believe in the supernatural nature of what was happening. He was sure that people were behind it all, possibly former clients or accomplices of Ivanov who had escaped justice, or worse, new criminals inspired by the story of the Tula gravedigger. In October of 1913, exactly 1 year after Ivanov's exposure, Dmitry decided to conduct his own investigation. Armed with a flashlight and a revolver, he went to the cemetery late at night. His goal was to track down those who were behind the new desecrations of graves and put an end to this sacrilege once and for all. That night, the cemetery was unusually quiet. Even the owls and bats, usually active at this time, had disappeared somewhere. Dmitri slowly moved between the graves, carefully listening to every sound. Around midnight, he heard the scraping of a shovel cutting into the ground. The sound was coming from the old part of the cemetery, where burials had been carried out since the beginning of the century. Sokolov extinguished his flashlight and cautiously headed there. In the dim moonlight, he saw a figure bending over a grave. The man was digging methodically, occasionally stopping to check the depth of the pit. Dmitri crept closer, trying to remain unnoticed. When there were no more than 10 steps left to the figure, he turned on the flashlight, directing the beam of light directly at the grave desecrator. "Stop! Don't move!" shouted Sokolov, drawing his revolver. The figure froze, then slowly turned around. Dmitri saw the face of a young man, distorted by fear and something else, some kind of morbid obsession. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Dmitri asked, not lowering his weapon. The young man was silent. His eyes darted around like those of a cornered beast. Sokolov took a step forward and suddenly felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. Someone had hit him from behind. The flashlight fell from his hands, went out, and the cemetery was plunged into darkness again. Before losing consciousness, Dmitri heard a voice that made his blood run cold. "I told you we'd see you soon, Mr. Sokolov." It was the voice of Alexander Ivanov. When Dmitri came to, he was lying in a coffin again. But this time, the coffin was already in the ground. The lid of the coffin was ajar, and faces were looking down at him from above. Many faces. Some of them belonged to living people. They were young, with burning eyes of fanatics. But there were other faces, deathly pale, with sharpened features, with empty eye sockets. "Welcome to the meeting of our society, Father Dmitri." A familiar voice rang out. A man pushed through the circle of people surrounding the coffin and leaned over Sokolov. It was Alexander Ivanov, alive, real, with the same cold gaze and mocking smile. "But how? I saw you died," Dmitri stammered, not believing his eyes. "Death is just an illusion, Father Dmitri, especially for those who know its secrets as well as I do," Ivanov replied. "The corpse the police saw belonged to one of the vagrants. I prepared him in advance to look like me, and the poison was fake, just a theatrical trick." "But why? Why did you fake your death?" Ivanov laughed. "To start all over again in a different place with different people but with the same business. You see, Father Dmitri, my work is much more important than you think. I don't just make money off the dead. I serve them, and they serve me." Sokolov looked around. Now he saw that he was in some kind of dungeon. Around the coffin stood dozens of people dressed in black robes. Some held candles, others strange objects resembling bones and skulls. "What is this place? Who are all these people?" "These are my followers," Ivanov said proudly. "People who understand the true nature of death. Some of them work in cemeteries all over Russia, others in hospitals, morgues, police stations. They all help me in my business." "And those others?" Dmitri nodded toward the pale figures standing in the shadows. "Ah, you noticed our special guests." Ivanov's smile widened. "They are the result of my experiments. You see, years of working with the dead have taught me a lot. I began to understand that the line between life and death is not as clear as most people think. With the right knowledge, the right substances, you can blur this line." Dmitri felt a shiver of horror run down his spine. He didn't want to believe what he was hearing, but the pale figures with empty eyes, standing motionless among the living, left no room for doubt. You resurrect the dead." "Not exactly resurrect," Ivanov replied thoughtfully. "Rather, I don't let them die completely, or I bring back what has already partially gone. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't studied the secrets of death as I have." "It's blasphemy," exclaimed Sokolov. "You are violating the laws of nature and God." Ivanov snorted contemptuously. "If God were against it, would I be able to do what I do? No, Father Dmitri, what I do is evolution, the next step for humanity. Imagine a world where death has no power, where people can return from their graves, where the greatest minds of the past can continue to work for the good of society. Those are not people, Dmitri whispered, looking at the pale figures. Those are shells without souls. Soul? Another illusion. What we call the soul is just electrical impulses in the brain, chemical reactions, and they can be recreated if you know how. Ivanov made a sign to his followers, and two of them lifted Dmitri out of the coffin, tied him up, and stood him on his feet. Sokolov did not resist. He was too overwhelmed by what he had seen and heard. "I didn't bring you here to kill you, Father Dmitri," said Ivanov, looking him straight in the eyes. "I want to offer you to join us, to become part of a great experiment. You are smart, observant, you have access to church records, and a certain amount of influence. You can be very useful." "Never," Sokolov replied firmly. "I'd rather die than become part of this sacrilege." Ivanov sighed with feigned regret. "I thought you'd refuse, but you see, you have no choice. If you don't join us voluntarily, well, I have ways to make you become one of us, albeit in a slightly altered form." He snapped his fingers, and two of his followers pulled an object out of the shadows. With horror, Dmitri saw that it was the body of a young man, very similar to himself. The body was naked, with pale, almost waxen skin, and clearly dead for several days. "Do you recognize him?" "Mikhail Varnin, a seminarian from Ryazan. Amazingly similar to you, isn't he? Suitable height, build, facial features. When I saw him in the morgue, he died of pneumonia, and I immediately thought of you, Father Dmitri, of how useful he could be." What are you going to do?" Sokolov's throat went dry with fear. "A simple replacement," Ivanov replied calmly. "Your consciousness, your memories, your knowledge, all of it will be transferred to Mikhail's body. And your body, well, it will join our collection. Maybe we'll use it for the next funeral, or maybe we'll find another use for it." "That's impossible," exclaimed Dmitri. "No one can move consciousness from one body to another. Science and magic can do many things you don't even suspect, Father Dmitri. Over the years of working with the dead, I have studied ancient texts, alchemical formulas, forgotten rituals, and I have found a way." Ivanov's followers prepared a strange altar in the center of the dungeon. On it stood bowls with liquids, lay tools resembling surgical instruments, and objects whose purpose Dmitri could not determine. Two men placed Mikhail's body on the altar and began to rub it with some kind of ointment, chanting strange words. "The ritual will begin soon," said Ivanov, watching the preparations. "By dawn, you will become a new person, Father Dmitri." Literally. Sokolov tried to resist, but he was held tightly. He began to pray, first in a whisper, then louder and louder. "Pray as much as you want," Ivanov sneered. "God doesn't hear you in this place. Other forces rule here." Suddenly, there was a noise from the darkness, shouts, sounds of fighting, gunshots. Ivanov's followers scattered in panic. Some rushed to the exit of the dungeon. "What's going on?" roared Ivanov. "The police, they found us," someone shouted. In the next moment, police officers, led by Captain Trafimov, burst into the dungeon. A scuffle ensued. Ivanov's followers resisted, some using knives and even firearms. The police officers fired back. In the confusion, Dmitri was left to his own devices. The men holding him had rushed into battle. He fell to the floor and crawled toward the exit, trying not to get caught in the crossfire. Suddenly, Ivanov appeared before him. His face was contorted with rage. "This is your doing, isn't it? You brought them here," he hissed, grabbing Dmitri by the throat. "I should have killed you that night you stuck your nose in my affairs." Ivanov's fingers tightened. Black spots swam before Sokolov's eyes. He desperately gasped for air, trying to free himself from the gravedigger's grip. And at that moment, a shot rang out. Ivanov's grip weakened, and he slowly slumped to the floor. Captain Trafimov stood over him with a smoking revolver in his hand. "This time, I'll personally make sure you're dead," the captain said, looking at the gravedigger's prostrate body. Dmitri struggled to his feet, massaging his throat. How did you find this place?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "After your disappearance, we started searching," Trafimov replied. "The watchman saw you go to the cemetery at night. We searched it and found traces of a struggle. And then one of Ivanov's accomplices, arrested earlier, confessed that they had a secret hideout in the abandoned catacombs under the old chapel. We organized a raid, and here we are." The police officers were finishing clearing the dungeon. Most of Ivanov's followers had been arrested, some killed in the shootout. The pale figures that had so frightened Dmitri were revealed in the bright light of the police flashlights to be just people, terminally ill, drugged, with their faces smeared with chalk to create the illusion of corpses. "It was just a trick," said Trafimov, noticing Sokolov's gaze. "Ivanov used sick vagrants, whom his men kidnapped from the streets, gave them opium and other substances so that they seemed dead but could still move, creating the illusion of living corpses in order to control his followers through fear and awe." Dmitri approached Ivanov's body. The gravedigger lay in a pool of blood. His eyes were open and staring into the void. A strange smile was frozen on his lips. "Make sure he's really dead," said Sokolov. "And this time watch over his burial." "Don't worry, Father Dmitri," nodded Trafimov. "I'll personally see that his body is cremated and the ashes scattered. He'll never bother anyone again." That day, an entire network created by Ivanov was destroyed. A group of people engaged in desecration of graves, trafficking in bodies, and fraud with fake funerals throughout the province. It turned out that Ivanov's activities were much larger than originally thought. He had accomplices in different cities, even in the capital. For several weeks, the Tula newspapers wrote about the Gravedigger's case, relishing the most gruesome details. Dmitri Sokolov himself became a true city celebrity, a brave victim who miraculously escaped a terrible fate. After these events, life in Tula gradually returned to normal. The cemeteries were cleared of all traces of Ivanov's activities. All the desecrated graves of those whose bodies were used in his machinations were reconsecrated and reburied with honors. Dmitri Sokolov continued to serve in the church, but not in the same place. He was transferred to a small parish in a remote village of the Tula province, partly for his own safety, partly because the church authorities were embarrassed by the whole story and preferred to remove its main witness far from the city. In his new parish, Father Dmitri led a quiet, measured life. The locals respected him for his gentleness and kindness. No one here knew about his role in uncovering the terrible crimes of the Tula Gravedigger, and he himself never talked about it. But at night, Sokolov was often tormented by nightmares. He dreamed that he was lying in a coffin, and Ivanov was leaning over him with the same mocking smile. "You think I can be killed?" the gravedigger asked in these dreams. "I know the secrets of death. I'll be back." Sometimes, Father Dmitri thought he heard footsteps outside his house, saw a figure flashing in the darkness, similar to Ivanov. The rational part of his mind told him that these were just the consequences of the horror he had experienced. But deep inside, there was a doubt. Was Ivanov really dead? What if he had somehow deceived them all again? But the years passed, and the fears gradually receded. Dmitri got used to his new life, found comfort in serving God and helping his parishioners. He almost forgot about the events of 1912, until one day, on a cold February morning in 1924, there was a knock at his door. Standing on the doorstep was a young man in tattered clothes, with a pale face and deep-set eyes that seemed strangely familiar to Father Dmitri. "How can I help you, my son?" asked the priest. The young man smiled, and there was something in his smile that made Sokolov's heart freeze. "Hello, Father Dmitri," said the stranger. "My name is Mikhail Ivanov. I am Alexander Ivanov's son, and I have come to continue my father's work." Dmitri felt a coldness creeping into his bones, and it wasn't the February frost. The fear that he had suppressed for so long returned with new force. "Alexander Ivanov had no son," he said quietly. "Oh, Father Dmitri." But the young man shook his head with the same mocking smile that Sokolov remembered so well. "You know that death is not the end. It's just a new beginning, and my father had many beginnings." Mikhail took a step forward, and and something metallic flashed in his hand. "And now it's time for your new beginning, Father Dmitri." 3 days later, the body of priest Dmitri Sokolov was found by local residents. He was lying in his bed with an expression of incredible horror on his face. The doctor who examined the body concluded that the cause of death was a heart attack, not surprising for a man of his age. Father Dmitri was buried in the small village cemetery. The coffin was closed because of the condition of the body, as explained to the parishioners. The ceremony was modest but dignified. Among the mourners was a young man who introduced himself as a distant relative of the deceased. He helped with the organization of the funeral and even made a significant contribution to the monument. No one paid attention to the fact that after the funeral, this young man did not leave the cemetery with everyone else. He remained standing by the fresh grave, and a strange smile played on his lips. No one noticed either that it happened that, 2 nights later, Father Dmitri's grave was found exhumed, and the coffin empty. And certainly, no one connected this to the series of strange funerals that began occurring in neighboring towns and villages in the following months. Funerals where the coffins contained people whom no one had ever seen alive. The story of Alexander Ivanov, the gravedigger who rented out coffins with bodies inside for fake funerals, did not end with his death. It merely transformed, took on new forms, and continues to live on to this day. In the stories that cemetery keepers tell each other late at night, in the strange occurrences that happen from time to time in quiet provincial towns, in the fear that grips us as we walk past old graves at dusk. Because, as Ivanov said, death is not the end. It is only a new beginning. And who knows what might return to us from the grave if we know the right words and rituals. Perhaps that is why in many villages in Russia, there is still a custom of placing special objects in the coffin, meant to keep the deceased in their grave. And perhaps it's no accident that many cemetery guards refuse to work alone after dark. After all, you never know whom you might meet among the graves late at night. And, what's even worse, you never truly know if the coffin you are lowering into the ground is really empty, or if there is already someone lying there watching you through the cracks in the lid, waiting for their chance to get out.